People lingering by the door, but I think we should try to begin. And I will interrupt various conversations. First off, I have to ask that everybody turn off any electronic communication devices as they interfere with the sound system in the room, especially the speaker. We've had speakers forget. We have two events left in March. Both are Monday noon discussions. Next Monday at noon, Nadia Duke, Vice President of Programs for National Endowment for Democracy, will speak about democracy in Ukraine. And on March 29th, Tom Parfit, who is Moscow correspondent for The Guardian and happens to be here as a public policy scholar, will speak about security and human rights in the North Caucasus. And he's just finished a very interesting book based on his experiences walking across the North Caucasus. So that's a lively presentation. We have a lot of speakers coming up in April. The first Monday noon discussion, Sam Charup from the Center for American Progress will speak about the Obama administration's Russia policy. But I want to make note of two particular programs. On April 21st, from 2:30 to 5:30, Phil Donahue and Vladimir Posner will be coming to talk about their experiences in the media bridge at the end of the Cold War. For those of you who don't remember, this was a very important experiment in television, a kind of bi-national talk show between the United States and the Soviet Union, and Donahue and Posner were the MCs of that program. They'll be talking about that, and David Hoffman from the Washington Post and Heather Hurlbut from the National Security Network will comment on what they have to say about that experience. And then the next night, Thursday, April 22nd at 6 p.m., we will continue our series with the Harriman Institute focusing on contemporary Ukrainian literature, and Taras Prochasko from Ivano-Frankivsk will be speaking. This was an event that had been scheduled in February, but alas, it was canceled because of snow problems in Ukraine, not here. So hopefully the snow is in the past, even in Ukraine, and he'll be able to be here for sure. Well, we have no problem with snow today. I'd like to thank you all for coming inside on this beautiful day outside. The last time Sergei was scheduled to be here, however, he outran the snow back to Boston. And it's really a pleasure to have him here, in part to celebrate and talk about his book, Yalta, The Price of Peace, which is available outside, and he'll talk about that. But in part because he's an old friend of the Kennan Institute, and I think a friend and leader for everyone who is involved in study of Eurasia and North America. He was a graduate student at Kiev State University. He was chair of the Department of World History at Dnipropetrovsk State University. He worked at the Institute of Archaeology and Source Studies at the National Academy of Sciences in Ukraine, and then took a position at the University of Alberta before Harvard was lucky enough to lure him away from the far north of Canada. It's not quite the far north of Canada, but it's a long way north of Montana, so for Americans it seems a long way north. And he is, of course, the Hrushevsky Professor of Ukrainian History at Harvard these days. This book is something of a departure for him, I believe, because the books I'm familiar with really look at issues of religion and early modern Ukrainian history and Russian history. He's written 3 award-winning and really important books, The Cossacks and Religion in Early Modern Ukraine, Unmaking Imperial Russia, and The Origins of the Slavic Nation. And if you're this is about something totally different, but if you're unfamiliar with those works, you really should look at them. They're landmark studies, which explains how he has this named chair at Harvard. It didn't just fall from the air. So, welcome.
Blair, thank you very much for this wonderful introduction. Thank you very much for coming today. I'm also grateful to the Kennan Institute that originally we discussed the possibility of me talking here on the 5th of February. So exactly 65th anniversary of the Yalta conference, and Blair said, no, let's have you in March. And if we would schedule for the 5th of February, probably I would stay here for
until now.
Until now, most likely. So today is, of course, wonderful, wonderful day. Well, I also wanted to thank my publisher and its Viking for issuing the book, releasing the book exactly on the 65th anniversary of the Yalta conference. And I don't know whether my editor at Viking, Joy Dominil, is here. I'm not sure. Okay, but I wanted to say a few very good and positive words about her. She lives here in Washington, and she did a wonderful, wonderful job with the text. You will be exposed to my heavy accented and partly broken English for the next 50 minutes. You can take a look then at the text. It's flawless. So that's what kind of things that they're doing at Viking. I wanted to start with something that Blair mentioned here, and that's that all my previous experience, or most of my previous experience as a researcher and writer, dealt with a significantly earlier period, so 16th and 17th century, and then I was writing also on historiography, national identity, and religion in the 19th and 20th century. So this book is something really a departure and something new for me. And I wanted to explain how I arrived to this topic and to this subject in general. The publisher again told me that I have to come up with at least one good story that would captivate the audience of how that happened. I worked hard and I came up with two stories, and I don't want to sacrifice any of them, so I'll tell you the two stories of how I arrived to that topic. So the first one has to do with the fact that I grew up in Ukraine, and more specifically in southern Ukraine, and occasionally during summer vacations in school, parents would take us to the Black Sea, to the Crimea. And there was this talk about place that was out of reach for ordinary Soviet citizens. That place was called Livadia Palace. And, of course, everything that is out of reach attracts a special attention and interest. And on the top of that, you can add that I was growing up during the Cold War, of course, and then there were these rumors about people like Churchill and FDR coming to the Crimea, to the same place where I was. So certainly that was something that attracted me, the interest in the Yalta conference, something that happened almost in my backyard, was always there. But there is, of course, a major distance between being interested. If you're interested, you just grab a book and read. I kind of went a little bit further, and I wrote a book. So, and that's where the second story that I produced for my publisher came into the play. And that was, by the way, all two stories, both they are true. So in 2005, it was in May of 2005, and I was sitting on my stationary bike in the basement of my Edmonton home, and whatever channel I would flip, there would be discussion about Yalta, the Yalta conference. So what happened was that on the 6th of May of 2005, President George W. Bush went to Riga and delivered his speech about partly about the Yalta conference, comparing Yalta not only to the Munich that was done before, but also to Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And there was this lively discussion. Of course, there were conservatives and there were liberals. And what struck me was that the positions that they were taking and the arguments that they were coming up with were very known to me, very familiar. There was nothing new that was added to the discussion, brought to the table. And also the answers that they provided, somehow I didn't find them fully satisfactory. So this is one take on Yalta from one perspective. This is a take on the Yalta Conference from a different perspective. And that's more or less what I heard on TV, this kind of accusations going back and forth. And before 2005, actually, it was in the 1990s, I did some research, again, going a little bit outside of my original field. I did research on the liquidation by Stalin of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, and found something really very interesting and surprising, that the decree ordering liquidation of the church was signed at the time when Moscow, it was soon after the Yalta Conference, when Moscow was visited by Edward Flynn, a special envoy of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Edward Flynn was in Moscow to discuss the fate of the Catholic Church and Catholics in Eastern Europe. And I thought, isn't this funny that exactly at that time Stalin is signing the decree liquidating the Greek Catholic Church, the largest Catholic church, on the territory which is now, after Yalta, is part of the USSR and is recognized as part of the USSR. So watching these debates and discussions on TV, on the one hand, I knew quite well what President Bush meant when he compared Yalta to Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. To everyone who have been to Eastern Europe, it is quite clear that Yalta gave legitimacy to the borders that were established, more or less, that were established by Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So I was in agreement with that. But then there was another problem. Comparing a Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to Yalta meant also, to a degree, comparing FDR or Churchill to Hitler, or compare in general the deal where Hitler and Stalin consciously divide Europe, when, as far as I knew from my own research and from the literature, certainly that wasn't the case at Yalta, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So that was the immediate impulse that transformed my interest in the conference and in the place as such to this decision to go a little bit outside, not a little bit, but significantly outside of my normal area of research and writing, and do this book on the Yalta Conference. Well, there was a couple, actually more than couple, positive things that I thought put me in a better position than dozens of writers who were writing on the Yalta Conference before me, specifically during the Cold War. One of them was that the Cold War was over, and there was a number of positive things coming out of that. One of them was that I ended up in Canada and then in the United States. So, but that wasn't kind of related to my research. What was much more positive and much more relevant was that we now look very differently at many events of the Cold War, including the Yalta Conference. We now know that Yalta or Potsdam wasn't just a stopover. They were not at the beginning of the armistice that eventually could lead to the nuclear annihilation. We now know that the Cold War ended, and we now can look at Yalta and think that, well, you know, Yalta is at the beginning, not only maybe at the beginning of the Cold War, but also at the beginning of the longest peace in European history, or maybe the longest global peace in modern history. This is the perspective that probably no one would think about during the Cold War. Another positive thing coming out of the end of the Cold War was that for a relatively short period of time, between 1991 and 1996, the Russian archives miraculously got opened with new information, very interesting information, getting out to the scholars in Russia, in Eastern Europe, and also to researchers and writers here in North America. Well, a lot of elements and events of the Cold War were reevaluated in the light of these new archival documents and materials coming from the Russian archives. But surprise, surprise, no one, for whatever reason, decided to do that on Yalta, and I thought, okay, this is certainly something that works in my favor when I start this project. And last but not least, that was also the time when Margaret Macmillan published her best-selling book on Paris 1919, which for me was a proof that you actually can write about the peace conferences without putting people to sleep. Or if they still fall asleep, they go back to this book and keep reading it. So there was this kind of a new way of writing and new way of thinking about diplomatic history that was, of course, dominant in the West, and not only in the West during the first half of the 20th century. And then as social history came and intellectual history, that became something that a decent historian would not touch, or at least in major universities, in many universities, diplomatic history wasn't considered to be a field to engage or to encourage students to work on. So bringing in cultural history and also this new findings from the Russian archives, and that was something new, and certainly that I believe benefited in favor of the project that I began in 2005. Well, indeed, in the Russian archives there was a number of very interesting findings, something that we didn't know before, certainly didn't know during the Cold War. One of them was, for example, that in 1944, before the Yalta Conference, the Soviets had a number of drafts of the map of how to divide Germany in spheres of in the spheres of occupation. Eventually, it turned out that the borders of the Soviet zone of occupation became also the borders of the German Democratic Republic. No one, of course, could predict that in 1944. Well, now from the Russian archives, we know that there was also another map, another draft, where the Soviets were considering actually accepting the borders that would go further east, the borders between British or American zone of occupation and Russian zone of occupation. There were another findings as well, and mostly dealing with the Soviet intelligence effort during the Second World War and at the time of the Yalta Conference, whom you see here next to Stalin with an X is of course, Lavrentiy Beria, the head of the secret police. And Lavrentiy Beria took part in the Yalta Conference. He was the only Soviet leader who came to Yalta, not on his own, but his son came to Yalta as well, and son was someone who was involved directly in eavesdropping operations. He worked for Stalin, listening to FDR and transcribing FDR's conversations at Tehran, and he performed more or less the same functions at Yalta. Again, this is something that scholars and historians didn't know during the Cold War. Other people involved in the Soviet intelligence effort started to write their memoirs, and one of them was Zoya Zarubina, for example. I was really surprised to find, to find in FDR library a picture of an American officer with someone who really closely resembled Zoya Zarubina. She writes that she was at Tehran. She writes that she was at Yalta. We know that she worked on Manhattan Project, serving as a translator. We don't know exactly what she was doing at Yalta, but again, that kind of information now becomes more and more available. And last but not least, of course, more information and more debates on Alger Hiss and his role at Yalta. This is kind of materials, facts, information that we didn't have before 1991. But probably the most interesting what the Soviet archives gave us was a better understanding of the ways how the Soviet side, Stalin and people around him, imagined FDR, how they treated Churchill, what were their plans. Because the books on the Yalta Conference that were written before 1991, they were based on the American archive. So in the U.S. in 1955, the U.S. was the first to publish the documents, the protocols of the Yalta Conference. British were somewhat reluctant to do that, but still the British archives were accessible as well. And then when it comes to the Soviet side, it was kind of a black box. So the only what you get is what was in those protocols, and we didn't know what was going behind the scenes, and now we got that. And that information, new information, maybe not specific, okay, what was the map, who was spying, who was not spying, but the information that helps us to understand the mindset of Soviet leaders and Soviet experts and people around them. This is certainly something that wasn't known before and wasn't done before. I tried to pay in my book as much attention as possible to that kind of information, and came to the conclusion that a lot of things that are happening at Yalta can and should be explained not only through the paradigm of the clash of different visions and geopolitical agendas, but also what we see there is a major cultural clash. Cultural clash when it comes to political culture, when it comes to understanding of the world in general, when it comes to understanding of specific terms like democracy, for example, because Stalin and people around him, they're not lying when they're saying that they consider themselves to be Democrats. They have their own definition of what democracy was. And often using the same kind of words, talking about the future arrangement of the world, very often people live with different understanding of what was discussed and what were at the end results and conclusions. Looking at Stalin and FDR here, this is the meeting that took place, a very well-known picture. This is the meeting that took place before the start of the Yalta Conference on the afternoon of the 4th of February, 1945. Well, Stalin, for example, never was able to understand what democracy really meant and what kind of constraints democracy imposed on the leaders, Western leaders with whom he was engaged in negotiations and conversations. When FDR, for example, would make references to Congress, or Churchill would talk about the need of approval of this or that by his war cabinet, Stalin never took this seriously. He would mention the Supreme Soviet or Mr. Kalinin, or would say that I can't go back to Moscow because what the Ukrainians would say and what Russians would say. So for him it was a complete game. His understanding was he was talking more or less like he would be talking to Hitler. When it comes to FDR, again, there was a lot of misunderstanding on his part and Churchill's part. For example, they were really under the spell or charm of this Joseph Stalin, who, unlike Molotov, was basically a likable person. He was a charming at Yalta. The Western diplomats write about this again and again and again. And they believed that that nice person was basically pushed in this anti-Western position by hardliners in Politburo, like Molotov or Beria, of course not knowing and not basically understanding what dictatorship or what tyranny really meant, that those people, their wives or members of their families could be in Gulag, and they would be still sitting around the table during the Politburo meetings and discussing things and voting. That certainly understanding, that kind of understanding wasn't there. Also, the price of human life, that was something that Western leaders couldn't really grasp, that for Stalin that was next to nothing. FDR, for example, believed that he will be able to deal with Stalin in the future after the war, because the Soviet Union was so devastated by the fighting, and that, of course, Stalin and his government will need loans and will need money and will need assistance to raise the living standard of the population. Of course, Stalin couldn't care less about population. So what we see here is not just this traditional approach that someone kind of miscalculated certain things, or that Stalin was lying, or that information wasn't on the table. All of that was true, and a lot of that was going on at Yalta. But there is one more layer of this major misunderstanding and mismatch between what I present in my book are two worlds with quite different value systems. The same was true also in terms of the ways how, for example, Churchill looked at Stalin. Stalin had this image of the West and Western leaders basically as a capitalist thieves. And what that meant was that any kind of deception was acceptable and was morally justified when you deal with capitalist thieves. And the West, and especially people, for example, in the British Foreign Office, they paid back by looking down at the Soviets as basically second-rate, not exactly Untermenschen, but certainly someone who was not up to the standards of Western civilization. A bunch of Slavs, Jews, and Asians who couldn't sustain work for a longer period of time, who can't be trusted, and their approach, if Stalin and the Soviets looked at the West using this kind of a class paradigm, the West was looking down at the Soviets, looking basically the civilizational paradigm, where, of course, the Russians and the Soviets were not up to the standards of real civilization and were not fully civilized. One of the best examples of this absolutely lack of understanding of what was going on was the case of the exchange of the prisoners of war. From the American point of view, the exchange of prisoners of war, well, that's what any decent leadership is supposed to do. There is no higher priority for the Western commanders, military commanders, to get their people back after the hostilities are over. And from the Soviet point of view and the Soviet perspective, there is no higher crime than to end up in the hands of the enemy. So Stalin is trying to get his people back and not only military personnel, but also civilians who are running away from the Red Army in order to punish them. The West tries to get their people back in order to save them, to feed them, to give medical support, and so on and so forth. And we are talking here about the exchange, and in legal terms, it's about the exchange of the prisoners of war. British had information about what was going on. To a degree, that information was available to Americans as well. But again, on the level of FDR, on the level of people around him, certainly it was difficult for anyone who grew up in democracy, who grew up in Western army, or through the ranks in the Western army, to imagine the logic of thinking of the other side. And last but not least, there were also these major differences between the Western allies themselves. I teach, that was my second year that I was offering a course, a research seminar on the Yalta Conference. And one student wrote a paper on the American-British relations during Yalta and around Yalta, where he came to the conclusion that there was no West at Yalta. That when we talk about West and Stalin, really what we impose on the events at Yalta is the paradigm of the Cold War, when there is West and there is East. Well, what is happening at Yalta very often that there are really three, not only leaders, there are three teams and three agendas and three visions that negotiate with each other. And this picture, this is the meeting of FDR and Churchill at Malta on the 2nd of February 1945, when the two Western leaders, I keep using this term, were on the way to Yalta. The image that the picture projects is the image of close cooperation. In reality, there is no cooperation at all, and FDR tries to do whatever, sightseeing, whatever, but not to have meaningful discussions with Churchill and the British, and they're really very upset going into a major conference without common position. Well, because FDR doesn't want common position, because he believes that his interests and interests of the British Empire are quite different. And they are supposed to be different because the British Empire is a colonial power. And colonial power and continuation of the empires, this is something fundamentally, morally, and otherwise wrong about that. And Churchill tries to say that, well, we did for the promotion and bringing democracy to the world more than any other state or power, imperial or not imperial. Well, returning to this picture, there is no negotiations because what is outside of the picture, there are daughters of FDR, Anna Bottiger, and Sarah Oliver, daughter of Churchill, who are present during this meeting. This is just a photo opportunity. There is a discussion of whatever, family events, maybe some mention here and there of foreign policy issues, but there is no real discussion or attempt to come up with a common policy at Yalta during this one-day stopover in the Mediterranean. Now, I started this presentation saying that the level of the discussion that on TV that I saw in those days of May of 2005, immediately after President Bush's speech at Riga, didn't really satisfy me. And what I was trying to do when I was writing this book, and then I summarized those findings in the epilogue, I was also trying to reevaluate, in the light of this new archival findings and also new approaches, the basic standard approaches to the Yalta Conference as they developed in the 1940s, 1950s, and partly in the 1960s. I called it Yalta mythology, and I'll just walk you through some of those basic beliefs that I consider to be not reflective of the real situation either at Yalta or generally the real situation in the Second World War during the first month of 1945. Well, one of very persistent positions that is taken on Yalta is an attempt to explain what is considered to be a failure of American diplomacy and Western diplomacy, pointing to one person, to FDR, and saying that, well, he was sick, he wasn't supposed to go there. And of course, he allowed a much more well-prepared and in good health Joseph Stalin to really outsmart him, and Churchill as well. Well, what is absolutely clear is that FDR was really in a very bad shape. There is no question about that. We can find this information mostly in the reports of the British diplomats, but we know that also from the American side as well. What the new findings in the Russian archives don't tell us, or at least maybe that information is not released, we see any proof that the Soviet side was trying to take advantage of that situation in which FDR found himself at Yalta. There is also no proof that any position taken by FDR at Yalta was influenced really by his poor health. Again, I mentioned work done by some of my students. Another very interesting paper done also last fall was on FDR's performance at Yalta, where a graduate student took the transcripts of Tehran conference and Yalta conference and compared the frequency of FDR's participation in the discussion, and tried to come up also with some kind of a system to grade the quality of those interventions. And again, the result is that, which is obvious even with, after you look at those documents, that there is no one case where FDR would depart from established position without consultation, or that there would be a major departure from the well-established American policy before Yalta. Another myth that was very popular in the 1940s and early 1950s, this is regarding the Alger Hiss's role allegedly in persuading FDR to admit Ukraine and Belarus to the Organization of United Nations organization. And again, what we have and what we see now is, in reality, Alger Hiss is the one who is writing a memo and trying to push this position within the American delegation, precluding acceptance of Ukraine and Belarus to the Organization of United Nations. What that means in the light of the new findings about Alger Hiss's involvement in Soviet espionage, and from my point of view, from my perspective, it is proven to a degree that it can be proven by history and historians. It looks like that the Soviets probably mismanaged one of their main assets at Yalta. From what we know, this is coming also from the Venona traffic, is that if Alger Hiss really worked for the Soviets, he worked for the military intelligence, who were not interested in the State Department, information on the State Department. Another major, what I consider to be misunderstanding about Yalta, this is belief that at Yalta the decisions were made that led to the division of Europe into two parts. So that the division of Europe happened really at Yalta, and then we have this Yalta Order. And French, of course, and Charles de Gaulle were very active in making this case. Well, the question that received most attention at the Yalta Conference was the question exactly of Eastern Europe. So more time was spent on Poland than was on Germany or Japan, Far East, Iran, or any other major diplomatic issues. And the outcome of the Yalta was that there was no agreement on Poland. There was agreement on eastern borders of Poland or the western borders of the Soviet Union. No agreement on the western borders, and no agreement on the composition of the Polish government. Because there was no agreement, the decision was made that the negotiations will be continued by the Molotov and 3 Western ambassadors in Moscow. And those negotiations were going on for the next 2 or 3 months. Eventually, in June, there was a compromise decision reached. In June, when Harry Hopkins visited Stalin, not in February of 1945, in Moscow and not in Yalta. So again, this kind of a supposition about the division of Europe into 2 parts at Yalta doesn't hold too much water when you look at the documents and you look at the facts. Far East. There is no, at least on the basis of my research, any major discovery or finding that would undermine the traditional view of what happened regarding Far East and Soviet participation in the war. But tracking down basically almost hour by hour what was happening at Yalta, it was very interesting to see how reluctant FDR was to discuss the so-called political conditions. That meant the transfer to the Soviet Union of the Japanese territories and also de facto establishing the Soviet sphere of influence in Manchuria. And we have 3 or 4 memorandums sent to him already at Yalta by Leahy and military commanders. According to their estimates, if the Soviet Union doesn't enter the war with Japan, the American casualties could be in hundreds of thousands. Already in the fall of 1944, the American military came to the conclusion that the Soviet Union would enter the war with Japan with or without American encouragement, sooner or later. The problem was the timing. If the FDR and people around him wanted the Soviet Union to enter immediately after the end of the hostilities in Europe, they had to talk to Stalin, and Stalin wanted territories and wanted concessions. I like very much this picture of the Yalta Conference, and I use it on the cover of the book. And one of the things that it tells me is that Yalta Conference wasn't the Cold War conference. There are this military behind 3 leaders. It was the Second World War conference. When the conference was taking place, the enemy was not defeated yet. And the player with the most troops on the ground had the loudest voice, and that player was Joseph Stalin. This is a contemporary map drawn for the Time magazine about the situation in Europe around the time of the Yalta Conference. And it's the way to present the basically very obvious situation, punch and pressure. So the Soviets are advancing and the Western allies are recovering after Ardennes. The Soviets are 60 kilometers away from Berlin, and the allies are 600 kilometers, Western allies are 600 kilometers away from Berlin. Well, let me now pose the question that I define and call as the puzzle of Yalta, and at least for me that was a puzzle of Yalta. In all these debates that are going now for more than 60 years, there are really no people who, or at least on the Western side of the debate, who would be happy or satisfied with the results of the Yalta Conference. The results were horrible, especially when it comes to certain parts of Europe and Eastern Europe in particular, and I come from that part of the world. So this is more or less, there is a consensus whether you are talking about left or right, whether you're talking about liberals or you're talking about conservatives. But then there is another part of the very same situation, that no one, and it's after years of research, after new archival findings, after the tons of writings and books and articles produced, no one really can suggest any viable alternative to what happened at Yalta. And I call this the puzzle of Yalta, and I'm going to devote the last 5 or 10 minutes, depending on how lenient Blair will be, to discussing the puzzle of Yalta. So how you bring these things together? On the one hand, certainly something very negative happened. On the other hand, there is no viable alternative. And why then Yalta gets all the blame, if and maybe not other conference? For example, if you look for the conference to blame for the partition of Europe, it would be much more natural to look at the October 1944 meeting between Stalin and Churchill, when they divided the Balkans. Just divided and percentage deal and back and forth. And there was a division. At Yalta there was no agreement on Poland. They left without basically agreeing on what will happen there. Or you can look at Potsdam, where more or less it was agreed that Germany, and that means the rest of Europe, will be divided into the zones of occupation that will be quite separate. So not Yalta. This is just an illustration or background to this question of why Yalta was blamed for that. Well, one of the reasons was the major discrepancy between expectations at the end of the Second World War and the actual results of the Second World War. The expectations were extremely high. And in 1944 and 1945, the American newspapers were writing that, well, Americans are winning this war, and the next world, the peace that will come after the war will be American peace. And indeed, when you look at the American effort, they were basically supporting the war effort of Stalin, they were supporting the war effort of Britain and Churchill, and with D-Day and invasion of France, invasion of Europe, the American troops were there on the ground, not only in the Pacific against the country that attacked the United States, but also in Europe. And this is all true, but this is all only part of the story. This is map, and this is basically some data that illustrates this map, and I'll explain to you. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to do a better job of transferring the table to this format. This table, I'm bringing it here to compare the Soviet war effort with the Western war effort. And one way to look at that would be to speak about the casualties. And Soviets are much higher than Western. Another way would be to look at the number of the divisions on the Soviet side and on the Western side. But I didn't like those approaches because it's always one of the way to explain that would be saying, okay, the West was more effective. The West was actually caring about the lives of the soldiers, which is absolutely true. But this is the number of the German divisions on the different fronts, and the first line, this is number 3 and 3 and 3. This is the number of divisions in Germany. Then we see the second. This is the number of divisions on the Eastern Front, 146 in January. Then the Soviets start the winter offensive, and by the time of Yalta, we have 173 divisions on the Eastern Front. And the next is the number of divisions on the Western Front, 68 during the Yalta Conference. And then here are the divisions in Italy, 27. This is the number of German divisions that are fighting on the Eastern Front and on the Western Front. And from my perspective, from all the data available, it represents the best, the basically war effort and sacrifice, and also it explains gives a good understanding of why we get this map. Why the Soviets are 60 kilometers away from Berlin and the Western Allies are 600 kilometers away. What we see at Yalta and after Yalta, especially that became very clear during the last day of the Yalta, there is a general excitement, especially on the Western side, with the results of the Yalta Conference. It is represented as a major success, as a major victory, and it is certainly oversold in this country, and it is oversold in Britain as well. What you see after the Yalta Conference is return back to the normal situation, where it's extremely difficult to talk with the Soviets, where it is extremely difficult to reach agreements with them. And after the excitement of Yalta, the first major crisis around the prisoners of war in March of 1945, again emotionally and culturally very loaded question, starts the process that creates the atmosphere, the psychological atmosphere that is really leads eventually to the Cold War. Yalta doesn't lead to the Cold War. The Cold War doesn't start yet for the next 3 years. But this major disappointment, the belief that you can't trust Soviets, that the only way to deal with them is through force, is something that gets to the newspapers, gets to the media, and gets to the diaries of the participants very soon after Yalta, March and April of 1945. I'm running out of time, and I'll skip a number of slides here, and I'll go directly to the lessons, or the way how I understand these lessons. Okay, so if there is very little that we can suggest that the Allies could do better at Yalta, probably they were not supposed to certainly sign those agreements on the exchange of prisoners of war. Probably they could negotiate better and get a little bit more, maybe 2 or 3 more members of the democratic parties into the Polish government. But these are really, when you look at the results of Yalta and the results of the Second World War, these are really marginal things and marginal questions. So if we can't come up with that kind of suggestions and with the benefit of hindsight, with the benefit of research, what are the lessons of Yalta? And I saw them and see them, and I wrote the book keeping this in mind, mostly in the realm of values and culture and morality. And my basic conclusion is that if the West is engaged in the alliances with the dictators, if the West is engaged in the alliances where there is no common moral foundation, where there is no value system that would be shared, sooner or later, these alliances would not only fall, but would result in a major price that will be imposed on the parties involved, and certainly on the world, or at least part of the world that was considered or was discussed at the conference or was part of the alliance. Joseph Stalin was certainly not the first dictator whose power was built during the war with the Western help. We just can point to the Lend-Lease. And as this cartoon suggests, he wasn't also the last one. The situation in which the former ally turned into the adversary, the ally of yesterday is adversary of today, is something that repeats itself again and again when it comes to the Western policy and Western politics, certainly after Yalta and after the Second World War. Well, the world is too dangerous place and too complex place for anyone to suggest that alliances should be based only on common values or common culture. But one thing that we can learn from Yalta is that knowing your ally at least as good as you know your enemy is certainly a major requirement. Because if the alliance is not based on the common values, and the Grand Alliance wasn't based on common values, the difference between ally and enemy can be just a matter of time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. I'm going to open up in a moment, but particularly given your academic work before this work, it does seem to me that in addition to values, there's another tension which has to do with different understandings of time and different time horizons. Mm-hmm. And when you were talking about the expectations were especially high in the United States after Yalta, there are other examples of unrealistic American expectations, but in part, I think it's possible to argue that they have to do with the expectations of immediate results. And then when you get 50, 60, 100 years out, and the world doesn't appear as it did, as you wanted it to appear after 2 or 3 years, there's great disappointment and tension. So we can think about the collapse of the Soviet Union and our relationship with Russia, about how we expected a transformation which hasn't taken place, and therefore it's not that unusual to hear about how the Russians have failed, or how Ukrainian democracy is a disappointment because here we are 5 years after the Orange Revolution and they're not in NATO and they aren't in the European Union, they don't function like us. Therefore, it's a failure. How much do you think differences in time horizon were part of the cultural differences which you're talking about?
Well, on the surface, all three leaders at Yalta were talking about the 50-year peace, or at least 20-year kind of a peaceful coexistence in Europe and in the world. And for Stalin, it was a very specific issue. It was an issue that he wanted to establish the Soviet Union as a country that no other country in the world would dare to attack. So he needed a breathing space. But again, they were talking about 20, 50-year horizon. So from a horizon from that point of view, they were allegedly on the same page. But again, in the democracy, and that's also one of the differences between the negotiators at Yalta, Stalin could afford really to take a long-term view, because he wasn't really responsible either to Politburo or to the Ukrainians or to the Russians, how he was saying. Well, of course, the electoral cycles in the U.S., in the United Kingdom, they affect in a major way this expectations and time horizon, and as on a different in a different regard was said by Charles Bolin in a letter to Cannon from Yalta. He wrote to him saying that the policies of that kind cannot be adopted in a democracy. It was not about time span, it was about the division of Europe into two parts, and just a very drastic kind of a turn of policy regarding the Soviet Union. But this is something that certainly comes with electoral democracy. And I talked about lessons of Yalta, and my lesson was mostly moral. There was another scholar of Yalta. His name was Richard Nixon, and at the time when there was a breakthrough into the Watergate complex here, he went to Hawaii, it seems to me, and he took volume of Churchill's memoirs about Yalta, and he was reading about Yalta because immediately before that he came from the Soviet Union, the first president of the US to visit Soviet Union after Yalta, after FDR. He did more or less the same as did FDR. He immediately went to the Congress and addressed Congress. And then in his diaries, it's interesting what he learned from Yalta, and he said that, okay, it's absolutely inadmissible to oversell the results. And when he addressed the Congress, he said, we are at the very beginning of a very long road to basically improving our relations, and that was certainly one of the lessons that he learned from reading Churchill's memoirs about Yalta.
Floor is open. Thomas, we're getting you a microphone right now.
My name's Thomas Grindley. I found it interesting that Stalin wanted other Soviet republics to be members of the United Nations. In particular, it appears that he wanted Ukraine and Belarus to be members. So it seems that Ukraine and Belarus were particularly key Soviet republics. And this seems to be borne out at the dissolution of the Soviet Union by Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Could you comment some more on the negotiations about membership of the United Nations?
Well, thanks for this question. Before Yalta, the Soviet position was that they wanted all 16 at that time republics of the Soviet Union to join the United Nations. And the American response was, then we want all our states to join the United Nations. So by the time they got to Yalta, Stalin and Molotov, after they accepted the American formula on the voting procedure at the Security Council, they immediately proposed as a basically almost horse trading or something like that, this idea that 3 republics of the Soviet Union, 3 additional republics should be added. And those were Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania. but they also let it know that it was basically a negotiation position, and then they would be satisfied with two republics, Ukraine and Belarus. The way how they presented their case was that those were republics that were attacked the first, or among the first Soviet republics, and whose population contributed the most to the war effort and what was expected to be victory. When there was opposition, there was very clear opposition on the American side, and on the British side there was support for the Soviet position. So one of those cases when there are not two sides at Yalta but three sides. Then Stalin apparently approached FDR privately and told him that he needed those two Soviets. Well, where is Stalin? Okay. He needed those two Soviet republics in the UN because there was a pressure on him at Politburo. And then there was a question of possible Ukrainian independence, and that his position in Ukraine was really difficult and that would help him. And Stettinius then commented on that in his memoirs, saying that we couldn't, of course, know how serious and how big was the Ukrainian problem, but we all heard rumors in 1941 when Germany attacked the Soviet Union that Ukraine could succeed. So that was those were the arguments used by Stalin privately already in conversations with FDR. Why they wanted those republics? They were, well, not only Stalin, but all of them. Those were people who lived through the 1920s, 30s, and that was their experience. And the worst nightmare for Stalin was that public embarrassment that happened to the Soviet Union when it was expelled from the League of Nations. And when FDR and Churchill explained to him that being the member of the Security Council and having the veto right, something like that couldn't happen again, he accepted the veto formula. But then he was afraid that he would be isolated in the United Nations, and he needed at least one or two additional players. Ukraine, in particular, played a relatively important role in the United Nations during the second half of the 1940s, before Stalin got on board the people's democracies from Eastern Europe. And then Ukraine wasn't needed as much as it was before. But in 1945, Stalin didn't know yet how successful his efforts will be in Eastern Europe. He could clearly count it on the republics that were part of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I'm going to take Michael and Marta, and then we'll come back over here. So, Michael, we're getting you a microphone.
Michael Dobbs, I'm a scholar here. I'm also writing a book covering a similar subject. I read your book with great interest. It was very informative. I'd like to say that. Just a couple of points. The photograph you showed of Zoya Zarubina, I think, that's not Zoya Zarubina. It's a woman called Joan Blight, who was an assistant to the British, helped to organize the logistics of the conference. She wrote a book about it, but that's definitely not Zoya Zarubina.
Okay, thank
you. On a different point, I thought you were a little generous to FDR. It's true that Yalta was not the sort of sellout that a lot of people depicted it as later. But if you look at FDR's performance at Yalta, and the thing that struck me is not that his mind, there was anything wrong with his mind. His mind was perfectly active and sharp. But he was a part-time president by that time. He was very sick, and he could only focus for 3 or 4 hours a day. And that actually did make a difference in the negotiations. Stalin, by contrast, was focusing for sort of 10, 12, 14 hours a day. reading many of the papers that, even the American papers that FDR was not reading. FDR didn't read his briefing books, and that had an effect on the negotiations. I mean, one example is the Kuril Islands, which were given away to the Soviet Union over the objections of the State Department experts. FDR hadn't read the State Department paper, and it later, I think you mentioned this in your book actually, that in the Soviet archives after the collapse of communism, one of the State Department archives papers on the Kuril Islands is found in Stalin's personal archive. So Stalin had read it, the American paper, but FDR hadn't. And, you know, that was certainly, it's a sort of marginal point, but it could have been avoided. They both, FDR and Churchill, didn't know about the distinction between the Eastern and Western Nysa lines, as a result of which, you know, huge tracts of German territory were given away. Of course, it was concluded later at Potsdam, not at Yalta, but they confused that at Yalta. But more importantly, you know, there's the question of, you know, FDR's sort of propensity to fudge everything. You know, he liked to have agreement rather than sort of delineating clear differences. And the agreement, so-called agreement on Poland, was a fudge, and which the Americans, there was sort of very sloppy drafting, which later came back to haunt the West in those negotiations that you talked about later in Moscow between the ambassadors. And by the time of, by March, April, you can see the ambiguity of the old Yalta agreement, which had been a fudge at Yalta, partly because of FDR, coming back to haunt the West. And, you know, so I think that if FDR had been clearer at Yalta, if he'd been able to study his briefing books more, he hadn't had this propensity to fudge, some of the negotiations might have turned out differently.
Well, thanks, and thank you very much for this suggestion regarding the picture. Certainly, I'll try to double check that. Regarding comments, I'm certainly glad to hear that your book will be taken a different venue and a different perspective on Yalta. For me, your comments basically don't solve the problem that I call the puzzle of Yalta. So you mentioned all these problems, that FDR was maybe not reading his papers, maybe he was too sick, couldn't work for more than 3 or 4 hours, and so on and so forth. And basically what I want after that is basically a list or explanation of what would happen differently. What would be the alternative? And I had all these things on my list, and some of them come from my book. And I wasn't able to provide satisfactory answer to myself. I have no reason to be specifically being big fan of FDR or Churchill or anyone else. So the reason why I taken this position in the book, because I wasn't able to provide answer that would satisfy myself. I can recommend a very interesting book by Mary Glantz, and it's on FDR and State Department, and basically the wars that he conducts with his State Department officials. And he doesn't read this stuff. Burns writes that he was absolutely appalled that on the road to Malta, on Quincy, FDR wasn't reading his briefing books. The thing is that questions that were discussed at Yalta and decided at Yalta were on the agenda, international agenda, and FDR was involved in that for 3 or 4 years. So for someone coming from outside, that was, how could it be possible? For FDR, that was part of his position, that was very often different from the position of the State Department. It's not that he didn't know about this position, but he preferred to take a different position. He had certainly no problem at all at paying Stalin with Japanese territories. And whatever State Department experts would be saying in terms of history, in terms of geography, in terms of anything else, he was under pressure from the military. He was prepared to give Japanese territory to Stalin. Issue for him was China. Paying one ally with sphere of influence on the territory of another ally, that was something that certainly bothered him a lot. Again, I would love to see how you solve, either you address this question or not, but how at the end you solve this problem that I certainly faced in my book. How you put all this, okay, he was sick, he couldn't focus for more than 3-4 hours, to the another part of the puzzle, and what a healthy president would do differently. There is, and I know that you're writing on Potsdam as well, there is, of course, Harry Truman, who goes to Potsdam with exactly the same issue at the top of his agenda: Soviet participation and entrance into the war with Japan. And this is a few weeks before the successful test of the nuclear bomb. I pose this question in the epilogue, whether a more healthy and more proactive president would make a difference. I wasn't able to come up with a positive answer to this question.
Mark? You can continue that. We're beginning right on
Martha
time.
Bortevsky. I'd like to get back to the whole so-called Ukrainian question. And did you find any information, any reflection of any of the insurgent activity that had already begun against the Soviets, or was it such a minor point that it didn't even make it?
Well, I'm looking for the map, sorry. Okay. In Yalta papers that I got access to, there was no mention of that. But what we have in the special files, that means the NKVD reports to Stalin and to Molotov, before Yalta and after Yalta, so it's almost on the daily basis that Beria reports on the activities of the Ukrainian insurgent army or of the activities of the NKVD troops on the territory of Western Ukraine. So this is something that gets on Stalin's table on the daily basis in the weeks leading to the Yalta conference. And the only discussion of that issue at Yalta was this when he approached FDR, saying that it would help him, that he has problems in Ukraine, and really he has. This is absolutely true. We know that from the Russian side, and that he needed UN membership for Ukraine for that reason as well.
Okay, right over here.
Will Amatruda, you've discussed the situation of Soviet boots on the ground in Eastern Europe. You mentioned the number of German divisions on the Eastern Front compared to the Western Front and the Italian Front. Could you discuss the situation that Timothy Snyder has written about, the clash between Poles and Ukrainians? I recently read his article on Volhynia in 1943 and the violence perpetrated by the UPA against Polish civilians there.
Well, I'll try to answer this question in the way that would be related to Yalta conference. The big issue, 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 the big issue at Yalta as part of the quote-unquote Polish question is, of course, the eastern border of Poland and the western border of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union wants this territory not on behalf of Russia, but on behalf of Ukraine and Belarus. And that's where this Stalin phrase comes from when he says that, do you want me to go back to Moscow and tell Russians and Ukrainians that I am more Russian or Ukrainian than Lord Curzon, who drew the line, or who gave his name to that border and to that line. FDR is the person who does this kind of the last attempt. Churchill is skeptical by that time, tried to persuade Stalin to give Lviv or Lvov to Poland, or to draw the border to the east from that city. What is interesting is that the issue of Lviv is discussed before Yalta at the War Cabinet in Britain, and there are rumors at that time that Stalin maybe is considering giving Lviv to the Poles and instead building another city, a major capital for the Ukrainians. And again, Eden is more kind of inclined to believe in that. Churchill is more skeptical. But what goes into the British debate, it is not present in the American one, is very good understanding that the question of Lviv and those borderlands, it's not just the Russian-Polish question, that there is this Ukrainian group there, and they write memos after memos actually explaining the situation and saying that, well, Poland is basically not in a great position because the way how it treated its biggest minority during the interwar period. On the American side, there is very little of that understanding, and this is something now that probably will support Michael Dobbs' position. There is a very interesting excerpt part in Harriman's memoirs when he says that in 1944 he comes to see the president, and the president is in one of his dreamy moods. And after reading some medical literature, I understand that dreamy moods was also part of the sclerosis. Something. This is one of the possible side effects. And FDR thinking about what to do with Lviv, and decides that, well, what we can do, we can have basically, the majority of the population was Polish. We can have this Polish city which will be surrounded by the Ukrainian villages and Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And Harriman says, but how they will work together. And FDR was a big believer, of course, in trade. He said, well, the socialist Ukrainian peasants will be delivering their goods to the capitalist Polish city, and there will be trade and exchange, and that how it will be solved. So that's one of the indications that when it comes to American side, at least at the top level, and Statinius wasn't much different in terms of his knowledge of Eastern Europe. There was much less sophistication and knowledge about East European situation than was on the British side. But again, the boots on the ground, that at the end what mattered the most.
Is there one very
either the British or did either the British or the Americans have good knowledge of what was going on in the borderlands in Volhynia in 1943?
British had much more information on that because the London government was the Polish government in exile was in London. But their main concern at that time, it was already after Tehran, and their main concern was what to do with the Curzon line and how to persuade the Soviets to move it. As far as I know, they never used this argument in the discussions. But they were drawing endless number of maps, including Arnold Toynbee was the author of 2 or 3 memoirs dealing with this Ukrainian-Polish boundary and Ukrainian-Polish border. The British raised the question of the Red Army going after the commanders and fighters of the Polish Home Army, Armia Krajowa. That was raised, including at Yalta, privately by Churchill in conversations with Maisky. But if they mentioned these massacres in Volhynia, at least I am not familiar with that.
I think we're about out of time. Will, very quickly.
If you just expand a little bit more about Churchill's role in Yalta. Does he have cards to play? Is he playing them well? Is he kind of isolated? Just give a little bit more about how Churchill played. What role Churchill played.
Yeah, thanks for this question. Well, this is a picture taken on the last day of the conference. Clearly, Churchill is an unhappy man. And one of the reasons for that is that he basically failed to create a common front with FDR on a number of issues. They were very close in Poland. But again, Churchill was prepared to go further than FDR, but on Poland they tried to produce the common front. What Churchill certainly was happy about was that Stalin never questioned the British actions in Greece, where the British troops actually were on the ground and were fighting against the communist military formations. That meant that Stalin kept his word that he gave in October in 1944 in Moscow, and that also meant that British imperial communications to the Suez Canal would be not endangered. Another big issue for Churchill was to build up France to the status of the great power, given that militarily it didn't kind of accounted for much. And he convinced eventually Stalin to not only allow Americans and British to give a separate zone of occupation for French, but also to add France as the member of the commission overseeing the occupation of Germany, given de facto the great power status to France. Eden at Malta said a very interesting thing about the negotiations, that forthcoming negotiations at Yalta. He said, we need a lot from them and we have very little to offer. And most of what the West had to offer, if there was West at Yalta, it was the Americans and Lend-Lease who could offer. And Churchill wanted the most, and he took the strongest kind of a position and stand on Eastern Europe and Poland in particular. Most of what we get about FDR's poor health comes from people in the British delegation. And it's not that FDR wasn't in poor health, but they also stress these things because for them that was an explanation why this wonderful friendship and alliance between Churchill and FDR wasn't working already for a while, but certainly didn't work at Yalta. I tend to understand that through a different kind of approach, that there are the failing capacities of the British Empire per se. If at Tehran British have the most troops, more than Americans, by Yalta, of course, they're in minority. And Yalta is certainly, it's in front of Churchill's eyes that the British Empire gets reduced from the status of the great power to some kind of a secondary role. And at some point, Eden even just explodes and tells Maisky that we are still a great power. And what I am saying in the book, that probably this kind of attack on Maisky was misplaced, really. Eden was supposed to tell that to FDR or to Stettinius, because the British were losing their great power status. Really vis-a-vis U.S. more than in relation to the Soviet Union.
Well, I want to thank you and recommend the book two small anecdotes, I guess, would be a way to end this. But one, in terms of reading briefing books, FDR clearly was not the only American president not to read briefing books. And there's a notorious story that's come out of Moscow in recent years about a meeting between a recent American president and a recent president of the Russian Federation, in which the American president said, well, Volodya, I know you're violating the treaty. I haven't read the treaty. I don't have to read the treaty. I just know you're violating the treaty. So this may be Russian disinformation, but it does appear that maybe there's a pattern among American presidents not to curl up with briefing books. But the more interesting thing for me actually was you started with Ed Flynn. And I noticed you start the book with Ed Flynn. Ed Flynn was the chairman of the Democratic National Committee. I also believe he was Bronx borough president at one point.
He was.
And this becomes very important because I spent an evening with George Kennan where he was disparaging of every American politician who's ever dealt with any Russian leader, and he was particularly contemptuous of FDR. And he said, FDR just thought he could charm Stalin, that if he made a good enough martini that Stalin would give him anything that he wanted. And finally, after listening, Kennan had a way in which when he got going, he could disparage anybody. And after listening to Kennan holding forth on and on about many examples of cravenous American politicians who weren't tough enough to deal with the Soviets, I finally asked him, was there any American politician in your memory who really understood Stalin? And he said, yes, Ed Flynn. And then he said, when Ed Flynn ran the Bronx, he ran it like Stalin, only he, unfortunately for him, didn't have Siberia. So I find it very interesting that maybe the real secret to Yalta was that FDR was there and rather than Ed Flynn. And maybe there's a good book to be written about him, too.
My answer just to... Well, Martini, what happened at Yalta was that FDR really invited Stalin for Martini and then complained that the best Martini would be if there would be lemon. And there was no lemon, so he served Martini without lemon. So by the end of the day, there was a lemon tree standing in front of FDR's office. And after the final documents of the Yalta Conference were signed, Molotov suggested to Stettinius and to Eden and Western diplomats to take as a souvenir a branch of lemon. And then I'm trying to make fun out of that and saying that the Western diplomats will live in Yalta with branches of lemon instead of branches of palms, yes. So maybe the real problem was that the martini that was served to Stalin wasn't the right kind of martini. Thank you very much for coming.